Thank you.
We're ready.
Are you going to tell us what we're going to do?
Oh, yes, I am. Thanks for joining us tonight. I told my wife that I would do this, and also my daughter-in-law, because they're down in Jonesboro and they watch these, either on Facebook or on YouTube. And I want to say hi to Owen, because he usually stands there and yells "Grandpa." So I want to say
right.
hi, Owen, and hi, Penelope.
Why are you not there?
That's my shameless bringing my grandkids into the lesson. So there you go.
He
We're
responded, and he's waiting for another response.
okay. Good deal. We are working our way through Paul's prison letters, and tonight we are going to take a look at the book of Colossians. So if you don't have one in front of you, it might be good to grab a Bible, because we're going to work our way through it in just a little bit. But first, Randall's got some announcements.
Need to remember Mark Bagwell's mom, Dorothy. We've been asked to pray for Andrew Cousins. He'll be reporting to the Air Force for basic training soon. Continue your prayers for Jennifer Oxford, George Bowman, Haley Carney, Krista Magnus in their battle with cancer. We also continue our prayers for Clint White, Roy Fanning, Mike Lacey, along with students and teachers, administrators, parents, as they deal with the upcoming school year. Other announcements: remember Sunday morning at 8 o'clock a service, and at 10:30 a service. There will be an adult Bible class at 9:30 here in the auditorium, and also the teens have a Bible class at 9:30 over in the annex. And the live stream will be of the adult class here at 9:30. All right, Parker, would you word our prayer, please, sir?
Yeah. Let's pray. God, we are thankful for just another week where we can come together and study your word and be encouraged by the good news that we have of the gospel, the good news that we have salvation through Christ. God, we're thankful that we are surrounded by so many incredible examples here at the Church of Bella Vista that we can continue to learn from and grow from, and continue to study with in an effort to live out the gospel in our lives, as well as share it with others so that they can live it in their lives, God. I was just ask that as we continue tonight in our study through Paul's prison epistles, that as we look at Colossians, that we can understand the ways that Paul has encouraged the Christians then to live as examples of you, as living sacrifices for you, God, and that we can better understand how to do the same. God, help us as we go throughout the end of the summer or the beginning of the fall with all the changes that are coming, and that we can, to the best of our ability, to the best of our knowledge, continue to spread your kingdom, to spread your message, and to with love and grace and respect for those around us as we try to navigate these difficult times, God. We ask these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so I hope that you guys have enjoyed this as much as I have, and I think we've really had a lot of good time kind of going through these books, and it's really interesting to kind of dig into. I'm going to talk about the background of the letter and of the city to begin with. So let's just jump in and think about the background or the city of Colossae. The location, it is in the Lycus Valley. It's not incredibly far from Ephesus. It's about 100 to 120 miles east of Ephesus in the Lycus Valley. It's about 11 miles, I think I read, about 11 miles from Laodicea, and about 15 miles from the Hierapolis. And those three form kind of a triangle right there in that valley. So as you were traveling, you could come to Laodicea, I believe, first, and then you could go on up to Hierapolis or veer just a little bit to the south to go to Colossae. It primarily Agricultural seems to be their big way of living. Had a successful textile industry. There was a certain color of wool that was produced out of Colossae that made it desirable. They're also, of course, like many of these other cities, located on a major trade route. Historically speaking, though, at least by the time of Paul, Colossae seems to be far less significant than its two neighbors, Laodicea or Hierapolis. And I was looking at that, and then I came across another source that said, but it wasn't always that way. That in 400 BC, Herodotus referred to Colossae as the great city of Phrygia. So it was much larger, much more populated, and I really don't know. There's really not any big thing that says this is what happened. There is an earthquake that will hit Colossae, but it's we believe after Paul's letters, not long, but shortly after that. There is evidence of a sizable Jewish community, and I say evidence really just by different historical records. Cicero recorded that there must have been a rather large Jewish population because of the amount of the temple tax paid out of Colossae. And so they assumed that there was a sizable group there. There's been no synagogue found, but Colossae's never been excavated. If you look at a picture, there's this big mound or tell that's there, and there's been requests made of the Turkish government to be able to go in and excavate, and they have never given approval, and so far it just sits there. So we don't really know a lot about the city that way. As far as the church in Colossae, there's no record of Paul ever visiting. As a matter of fact, in chapter 2 and verse 1, he refers to them as people that he has not seen. So he's never seen face to face. If you go all the way back to Acts chapter 19, during Paul's stay in Ephesus, Luke says that during that time that all of Asia heard the word, heard the gospel. And it seems to be somewhat of a consensus that Epaphras, who's mentioned in chapter 1, verse 7, is teaching them the gospel, that Epaphras was in Ephesus at the time, and he was converted, and he came back. I had one source that said, it was likely that he was Jewish, and so he would have come back to the synagogue and started, began to preach, and so the church is founded there. As far as the reason for writing the occasion, there's always seems like in most of Paul's, or all of Paul's letters, there's a reason, right? There's some sort of an occasion that he needs to read, or he needs to write. Epaphras has brought Paul some news of what's happening. And so even though they're increasing, he says they're increasing in faith and in love and in their hope and in numbers, it seems that things are going well. There's something kind of right underneath the surface, and it's referred to as a philosophy that's dangerous. And so we begin to think, okay, so what is this? And there's been a lot of writing and a lot of scholarly disagreement on what the heresy is in Colossae. One source I read says that scholar is no consensus, and there doesn't look like there's going to be one soon, is what he said. So there's several different ideas. There's several different thoughts. One is that it's Gnosticism or an early form of Gnosticism. And it would have to be an early form because Gnosticism doesn't really come along full force until quite a bit past Paul's writing. In Gnosticism, there's this idea of being enlightened or having special knowledge, and then there's a dualism of anything that's material is evil, and anything that's spiritual is okay, and so then that leads to, well, how is it that Jesus came in the flesh? Well, maybe he didn't come in the flesh because all material things are evil. So there's that. There's another thought that it could be having something to do with mystic Judaism, or more like folk Judaism, when it talks about new moons and Sabbaths and these special days that we're keeping, the worship of angels, or they don't call it the worship of angels, veneration of angels, I think is which is pretty fine line between veneration and worship. With special attention to the spirits. The word is stoicheia, or the elemental spirits of the world. And Paul will talk about those two, and then some in with maybe some pagan influence also, with this idea of spirits and how we deal with those. There's some things that as you read through that you're going to pick up. The idea of the veneration or the worship of angels, visions, those keeping those special days, asceticism, harsh treatment of the body.
Are you reading my notes?
But that's, no, I'm actually not. Yeah, saved myself a lot of time today. But those are the things that we kind of see. What Paul says in chapter 2, verse 23, that they have an appearance, kind of an appearance of being beneficial, but they're really not. These are from men. So just about the letter itself, it is, of course, written by Paul. And there's always debate about this. Well, did Paul really write it? Yes. That's my answer. Paul really wrote this with much the way he does other letters. He seems to dictate it to somebody who's writing it down, because the very last verse of this letter says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. So it's like somebody else is writing the rest of it, and Paul signs it. Speaking of excavating, I was Dr. Robertson and Harding was talking about the way Paul's letters were done, and he said, one of these days, he goes, if we ever come across a manuscript to one of these churches, and the writing of the body of the letter, the handwriting there and the handwriting at the end are different, he goes, we're really going to be excited. Right. And I just thought, there's a place right there, Colossae, that's never been excavated.
Right.
And you find something and you go, oh, there it is. It's delivered by Tychicus and by Onesimus. Tychicus is mentioned as delivering the letter to the Ephesians, and Onesimus we're going to talk about next week with when we look at Philemon. The letter has a very here's my big academic word for tonight, a very high Christology, a very high view of the person of Christ, of the person of Jesus. When we think of high Christology in the New Testament, especially if we're thinking about the Gospels, we think of John, statements like, the very opening of the book, or later on will be, I and the Father are one, or if you've seen the Father, you've seen me, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so those kind of thoughts, but Paul really hits this big in chapter 1 especially, but it's got a very, very high view of who Jesus is, as related to, you want to talk about the spirits and everything around you, here's where preeminence is. Here's where the superiority is. And that's all that I have.
Okay. My assignment, evidently, was the same as yours. Okay. 4 chapters, all right? And we look at the content, and it was about this Colossae heresy. Epaphras, as Jeff said, probably planted this church, and he's going to see Paul about this false teaching, this false doctrine, and ask for some kind of apostolic advice on how to handle the situation. And when we look at the book, the heresy, maybe as Jeff has mentioned, has 2 real possibilities. One is mystic Judaism. I read one author who talked about Essenism, that they took some of the thoughts of the Essenes and meshed it into Christianity, and they denied the deity of Jesus while upholding a lot of the ceremonial beliefs and practices of the Essenine community. One verse that lends itself to this conclusion is chapter 2, verse 16. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. That sounds Judaism. Or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon, or celebration of the Sabbath. The heresy could have been early Gnosticism, old scholarship class says that the heresy was Gnosticism. Modern scholarship says the epistle was written too early for it to be Gnosticism, but it could have been, before Gnosticism really got its foothold. I'm going to talk about, and I'm kind of going to go with Gnosticism tonight, not because I have any persuasion that that's what the heresy was, but because we've all heard the word Gnostic and we all say, what's that? So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. First, we note that Gnosticism was seductive. It had some kind of appeal to human wisdom. Something about it was very appealing to the early Christians. Paul says in 2:4, I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. Then in 2:23, he writes, such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom. So whatever this false teaching was, it was attractive to the New Testament Christians of the early church. Secondly, Gnosticism taught salvation was the result of superior intellect. This false doctrine taught that you had to be very knowledgeable in order to be a Christian. Those of worldly wisdom could share in the salvation, but the common man could not. Listen to Colossians 2:8 and 23. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world, rather than on Christ. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Truth is, this verse could apply either to mystic Judaism or to Gnosticism. Thirdly, Gnosticism involved angel worship, as Jeff mentioned. True Gnosticism taught that the material world was created by an angel. It taught that God created angels, and then that first angel created another angel, and that angel created another angel and another angel, and on and on. The last angel was said to have created the world. So the conclusion of this thinking was that God didn't create the world, and that God doesn't have anything to do with the world anymore. He's not active in it. This led to worship of angels, of course, rather than God. Paul strictly forbids this in 2:18. Gnosticism attacks, as you mentioned, the deity, the preeminence, the all-sufficiency of Christ. Of all Paul's writings, as you mentioned, Colossians has the highest Christology. Here in Colossians, Paul seems to be writing a commentary on the prologue to the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Word was God. Everything was created by Him. Nothing that was created was created that wasn't created by Him. And listen to Paul as he refutes this. He is in the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by Him and for Him. He was before all things, and in Him all things are held together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Once we were alienated from God, we were enemies in our minds because of our evil behavior, but now He has reconciled us by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Probably the best known Gnostic doctrine was this, that Jesus was just another created being, that he was another angel, and maybe a high-ranking angel, but just an angel nevertheless, and he certainly was not God in the flesh. That leads to Gnosticism being a doctrine that taught all matter, including the human body, was evil, was bad, and that the soul, the mind, the heart, the spirit was good, but the body was bad. This thinking eventually led the Gnostics to the denial of the creation of the material universe by God, and a denial of the incarnation of Jesus. Advanced Gnosticism taught that one could separate his body from his mind, and so that any evil we do was of the body, and the body was evil, and that the mind could be with God and walk with God, talk with God, have this hand-holding, walking, talking fellowship, but we could do anything we wanted to in the body. This kind of led to the fact that the body would go to hell, but the soul would be saved. This denies the bodily resurrection. You know, you get all kinds of problems there. Paul uses chapter 3 and first 6 verses of 4 to encourage us to control our minds by setting them on things above. Paul is saying, no, your body and your mind are connected. We can live pure lives, but we live pure lives by exercising our will in control of our flesh nature, our body nature. Listen to some of Paul's reasoning in 3 and 4, and I won't read it all. But since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you have died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, you will appear with him in glory. To put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. Since you have taken off your old self and its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the image of its creator. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another, forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Above all of these virtues, put on love. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, and whatever you do, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord. You know, the truth is, today we deal with a lot of false doctrines that are kind of close to some of these things that we've talked about. Mm-hmm. For instance, popular religious concept today appeal to the educationally elite, to broad-minded people among us. For instance, evolution, mm-hmm. maybe the vastness, the possible savability of denominationalism. You know, we could salvation by works versus legalism. You know, our brotherhood still struggles with what do you do with the balance between grace and works. Mm-hmm. Paul says we're saved by grace through faith, but in the very same stroke of the pen, he says we're created to do good works. Yeah. So we struggle with some of the same things they struggle with. Angel worship is big among some today. A lot of people agree that Jesus was a prophet. He was a good teacher, mm-hmm. a good man, a moralist, but he wasn't God. So, you know...
I love C.S. Lewis's thing about that.
What does he say?
He's either a liar or a lunatic,
Lunatic.
or he's Lord.
Or he's Lord.
Yeah, one of those three.
Take your pick.
Because
I believe I've got mine.
Because you can't say he's a good moral teacher if he's lying about being the Son of God.
No.
Or if he's believing, or he believes to be the Son of God when he's not, then he's crazy.
Then he's crazy. Right.
Yeah.
Our generation says we're not responsible for sin. You know, it's
Parker's fault.
You know, it's a disease of the body. You know, and the body is bad. Before I quit, I've got a question from one of our members. Sunday, one of our members said you talk often, and she was talking about me and you.
Okay.
About the hope of heaven.
Oh, no, mind.
And she said, perhaps I should not use the phrase, or perhaps you and I shouldn't use the phrase, hope of heaven. Rather, we ought to use the phrase assurance of heaven. And she says, will you address this Wednesday night?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with her reasoning, okay? Right. Biblical hope is different from worldly hope.
Right.
All right? When we talk about hope in the Bible, and it's talked about, Paul talks about it here in Colossians chapter 1, verse 5, he speaks of hope that is stored up in heaven, our hope that's stored up in heaven. Worldly hope is all about chance, like winning the lottery. The chance is 1 in millions, 1 in tens of millions, maybe 1 in hundreds of millions. But biblical hope, there is no chance involved. It's a confident expectation. It is an assurance. And the reason it's an assurance is because it's a promise of God for those who have been born again and who have lived life faithfully to try to put on the image of Jesus and to try to live as he lived, to try to control this fleshly body and desires with our spirit, with our will. Christian hope is an assurance because it's a promise of God.
Right. It's the way that the word is evolved, or whatever, however you want to say it. When we talk about hope, typically, when we talk about hope, then it's like you say, there's a possibility that this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. You know, I feel fairly confident that I'm going to go get in my car and it start and I get home. I mean, but I can always go, you know, I hope I make it. You know, I mean, if I've had and still have cars that I would go, hope I make it, right? Everyone says there's some chance that I might not. Right. That doesn't seem to play in to what Paul has to say.
When we say, boy, I hope I go to heaven when I die, I'm not sure that's biblical.
I'm not sure it is either.
Because there should be no hope, worldly hope, chance of failing there if I am a born-again, faithful child of God.
Right.
We ought to talk about my hope being in heaven, or my assurance being there.
Even, because I know that sometimes we think we do, but even if we don't have it right, even if we don't have everything right.
Oh, we don't have to have everything right. Or these people are in trouble.
Right. You talked about, well, you think about that too. You think about Paul writes to the Corinthians. And boy, you talk about a dysfunctional group, you know, what a dysfunctional group, but never once, I mean, is he saying, oh, well, you're out. I mean, I'm going, no, you've got some things you need to work on. And you mentioned a while ago, trying to find that balance, you know, between grace and our responsibility. It brought to mind another quote, and that was from Dallas Willard, and I can't remember which book it's in, but where he says, you know, we're saved by grace. And grace is opposed to earning. Right, but it is not opposed to effort.
That's right.
That's what, you know, there are things that, you know, and we'll talk more about this. I really think when we get into Philemon next week about what the gospel not only just saves us from, but what saves us to, and there's a big difference, you know, and of going, we can confidently place our trust in God because He said this is what He was going to do. The other place that came to mind was Paul in Romans 15, about the things that were written before were written for our learning, so that through endurance and through patience and of the scriptures, you might have hope, and not hope. But it's like, no, you can see what all God's done, and I'm going,
That assures.
I have an assurance, I have a future,
You bet.
and that's my hope.
You bet.
Not my hope is,
Yeah,
but
right.
yeah, okay,
False doctrines are going to come and go. We're going to have to deal with them.
right.
Apply us.
All righty. That's one of the more interesting ways I've heard it so far. But I'll try to. It sounds like a sticky pad. Okay. So, just kind of a quick recap as we look through Ephesians. We're looking at, or excuse me, Colossians.
Yeah.
Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and next week Philemon. These are all believed to be prison epistles, letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison in Rome. Acts 28 tells of that prison sentence, and they're all assumed to be written right around 62 AD. So all these are written pretty close proximity to one another. But it seems that Paul has still likes to write in a couple different ways, because last week as we looked at Philippians, we talked about we could go on for hours and hours and hours and probably still be going, and I'm sure that we'd still have a total of 0 people watching. But I mean, we could just go on for weeks about Philippians, because all 4 chapters, it's just application, 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 application. Then you get to Colossians, and it seems that the pattern here is kind of the first 2 chapters are problem, the last 2 chapters are solution. So you got problem, solution, and that's kind of where we see the application in Colossians is chapters 3 and 4. So I want to start by just looking at a few key phrases from Colossians chapter 3, just quickly reading through a couple of those key phrases. It says, "But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people, nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving." Sorry, thought I was being waved at. I thought I saw something there. All right, there we go. Be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise, so that it may go well. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests, with this in mind. Be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly as I should. So if you're following along well, you notice that was Colossians chapter 3, but it was actually Ephesians chapters 5 and 6. And so basically what I have to say about that is that Paul is using copy and paste long before Microsoft. So if you want to see the application for chapter 3, go back 2 weeks and Randall will give it to you if you listen to his application. So that was my attempt at application on chapter 3. Really, chapter 3 does sound very, very, very similar to what we've already looked at in Ephesians in some ways, but then also parts of it sound similar to things that we've seen in Philippians. And so I think that this is, there's a lot of good information here, a lot of good application here, but I think that this is Paul's kind of general address of everybody should do these things. I'm going to put this in all of these letters. I want to make sure, as I'm getting ready to pass on, that if there's nothing else you remember, every single one of these letters, which are going to be passed around, and hopefully you see them all, you'll see this theme of these things that you should be doing. This is how Christians should live. And so I think that is all good, but I think as a more specific application to the book of Colossians, the church at Colossae, chapter 4, verses 2 through 6 really give us kind of the application of what Paul is trying to say to resolve the issues in the first two chapters. So the first two chapters, if we go with Gnosticism being the heresy that is taking place, I think that these verses make a lot of sense. Even if you don't, I still think they're very helpful and make sense, but especially if you look at them through the lens of Paul's writing to a group that struggles with Gnosticism in an area where a lot of Gnostics are living. This is something that is going to be helpful. He says, really there are three things I think Paul says that are helpful. He says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. Devote yourselves to prayer. Out of all the things that we do as Christians, out of all the things that we are doing, first and foremost, we need to devote ourselves to prayer, to being watchful, to being thankful. We need to watch out for these heresies, we need to be on lookout for them, but we also need to be thankful for all that's been given. But most of all, we need to be prayerful. In everything that we do, we need to be people who are going to God in prayer, individually, communally. We need to be people who are always at the forefront of our mind, have prayer right there. That is the first response that we have to any situation, whether that be the heresy of Gnosticism, whether that be another heresy, whether that be a sin struggle of some other type in our lives, whether that be something that we are thankful and we are overjoyed about and we want to, and we're just excited about it. We need to be prayerful in all of these things. So in everything, be prayerful. And then in verse 5, number 2, so number 1, be prayerful. Number 2, verse 5, be wise. I think that this is really, really neat that he says, be wise to a group who is struggling with be smart. Mm-hmm. So a group of people who are very concerned with being smart, and Paul doesn't say be smart, he says be wise. He takes the focus from having a lot of knowledge to being smart with your knowledge. He says it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have, what matters is how you use the knowledge that you have.
So you would say that the Colossians chapter 4 and verse 5 would be incredibly relevant right now in a culture that's been described as a mile wide and an inch deep. Right? Right? I mean, we have all the knowledge that we want at our fingertips, but how do we use it? Mm-hmm. That's great. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I appreciate it. But yes, the big thing that they struggle with is how much more information can we consume. Paul says, quit worrying about consuming and start using the knowledge that you already have, but use it wisely. Use it in a good way. Use it in a way that is beneficial, that lifts other people up. The big one that he says, if you continue in verse 5, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Mm-hmm. The knowledge that you have, use that to act in a way that lifts up those around you, that leads outsiders, that leaves those who are outside of the body of Christ, that leads those who are maybe not thinking in the heavenward direction, as we kind of talked about last week. In the ways that you act, be wise so that they see it and they are led in that same direction. I think that's one of the huge things that Paul is trying to hit at here, especially with what he says in chapter 2. I won't reread it as Randall read through a lot of that just a moment ago, but chapter 2, I think he kind of makes that point, and in chapter 4 he comes back to it and says, don't forget, it's not about knowledge, it's about being wise. And then finally, number 3, so number 1, be devoted to prayer, be prayerful, be wise, and then be full of grace. Verse 6, let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And I would say that if we are in a culture, like you said, mile wide, inch deep, if we're in the culture that needs to be wise in the way that we act towards others, I don't know how much more so we are in a society that needs to be full of grace. It is a little bit saddening at times, not a little bit, it's a lot bit saddening, and not really at times, but all of the times, at how lacking that we can be in grace towards others. What I see Paul saying here, and maybe I'm reading into this too much, but what I see Paul really getting at is he's telling those who have gotten past the heresy. They've gotten past the Gnosticism. They say, this isn't a struggle for me anymore. Yes, I think that it's good to know. I think that knowledge is important, but I'm not going to get so stuck up on it that I'm not going to get so caught on to these Gnostic ideals that I forget what's most important, that is Christ and following him and being a disciple. I think Paul's talking to these people and saying, don't look down on those around you. Don't go just because you don't struggle with this, just because you are past this heresy, just because you are in a way where you are not struggling the same way as them. Don't go and tear them down. Don't go and look down upon them. Don't kind of scoff at what it is that they believe, but instead be full of grace in your conversations with them. Rather than getting into a debate with them, be somebody who tries to lift them up and gently point them in the right direction, which is really what he says at the end of verse 6, so that you may know how to answer everyone. He doesn't mean so that you know how to answer everyone so that everybody who agrees with you will know that you are right. He means know so that you may know how to answer everyone, so that those who disagree with you, even if they're not convinced, will still have a respect for you that will bring them back to that conversation time and time again. I think really those are the three big ones. And again, I know we've hit this one on the head quite a few times, and so I don't want to harp on it too much, but when we look at how we talk with others about social injustices, mask, what's going to happen in November, anything like that, rather than engaging in debate and attempting to force them into agreement with us, I think our goal should be to be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so when we have conversation with them, our goal isn't to convince, but instead our goal is to communicate. So those three things: be prayerful, be wise, be full of grace.
2 or 3 things that not even a hint.
Mm-hmm.
In our culture, not even a hint, that's difficult.
Right.
Not even a hint of sexual immorality.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, I've been asked over the years, what's coarse joking? For someone who is a jokester, is Paul talking to them?
Right.
You know, what is he saying? You have an idea?
Oh, no.
I'm asking you.
Oh, you're asking. Oh, I thought you were going to say, they asked me this, and this is what I've told them. I think it's got to do with what he says here at the end. I mean, there's obvious ones, right? Obvious coarse joking when you think about racial jokes,
Okay.
sexual jokes, those kinds of things.
Right,
There's obvious
right,
ones.
right.
But I think,
Hurtful.
right, and I think that's what he's kind of saying here at the end of Colossians, and going, watch what comes out of your mouth, right? Gracious,
Right.
has some value, seasoned with salt. I
Right.
mean, it's not just running your mouth, but it lifts others up. Typically, the coarse joking type thing is not really one that lifts others up. It's one that really kind of focuses on putting somebody else down, and it could be for various reasons, and it could be done with the best of intentions. I don't think God's saying, I don't want y'all to have a sense of humor.
Right.
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 I remember Walter Buchanan's thing. This has been 20-some years ago now, of saying the little story he told about the kid and his mom driving down the road, and they see a cow, and he goes, "Mom's that cow Christian?" And she goes, "I don't know why you asking." He goes, "I was just looking at the long face." We have a good time, but we pay attention to the people around us, and it's not.
Sure.
It's not hurtful. The idea of not having a hint of these things, and you read from Ephesians a while ago, that's not fitting for God's holy people,
Mm-hmm.
is that, of course, I've been kind of had my head in that, in the Pentateuch, for a while here with that. But that's when you get into Leviticus and all the regulations on sexual behavior. That's because the people around them were doing these things.
Right.
Right. And he's good. That's not, if I could, and I'm trying to paraphrase God here, and that's always dangerous, but to say, that's not what I made you for. Right. What he's looking for from Israel at that point is to go, I want people around you to know that I'm the God that created you and delivered you. You're different. This is how this is how you're supposed to be walking. This is how I designed you.
Right.
And I think it's the same thing when it comes, now to the covenant people of God is, I've designed you this way. This is the way I want you to behave. And other people are going to, yes, these other things that we keep talking about, and when you talk about sexual immorality, which just hits a, broad stroke.
It does.
But I'm going, he could say that's what the nations around you are doing.
Right.
But not you.
Right.
And it's not just limited to that. It's limited to all kinds of ethics, but it involves all kinds of ethics. But it's because the idea was that for people to go, wait a minute, this is what it looks like for humanity done right. And that's what we see in Jesus. This is humanity done the right way.
Well, I think when we get to discussing false doctrine, when we get to, quote, contending for the faith, defending the truth, it's easy for us to become mean-spirited.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what Paul is trying to say here.
Right.
Season your conversation, speak the truth, but in love and with love. Don't be mean-spirited. And sometimes we're guilty of that.
Right. I love Colossians, and for a lot of reasons, there's just lots of little things in there. There's not any doubt, the more that I've, read it, there's not a whole lot of doubt that, or it's easy to see why scholars, would say this is Gnosticism, because he talks about that a lot, right? About what you know and what you know. And where is that one? It's, that hearts be knit together at chapter 2. Yeah, in love to reach all the riches of the fullness, assurance, and understanding, the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Right. So those kinds of things, and that one, and the other one that I wanted to say, just because I've always found it neat, and y'all can hit mute if you want to. There's a word there, and I don't remember exactly what the word is in chapter 3 and verse 15, where it says, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. I had that pointed out one time that that word rule could also be umpire.
Oh yeah.
That it's Christ who decides what's fair and what's foul, what's in and what's out.
Okay.
And again, that's the rule of how we balance things. And going, that's it's just really, really good stuff.
One more thing before we go on. Address this thing of, this is really not, we're talking about prison letters, and maybe he is not really in prison. Talks about chains here. What are our thoughts? Is he, he's maybe under house arrest more than prison?
Well, if you ask some people, he may be in prison, not in prison, or he may be in prison, just not in Rome.
Yeah, there's there's a lot of that. For the most part, and I think when I say the most part, it seems to be, has been, over the years, the general consensus that this is during the 2-year imprisonment that we read about at the end of Acts, where Paul he's in his own house, right? His own rented house. People are coming and going, waiting for this, to appear before Caesar.
Right.
When I first heard somebody say, well, we're going to look at the prison letters, and they didn't include 2 Timothy, I thought they were crazy.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Because 2 Timothy seems to be, we're there, we're ready to die.
Yeah,
It's about over. And we're going, no, these are all in one group from, and again, consensus has been, or seems to have been for a long time, that this is in Rome. There are those, and they make a good argument, and of that he is not in prison in Rome, he's in prison in Ephesus. And that this is, no, actual prison in Ephesus. In his house arrest in Rome, or prison in Ephesus, and I'll just tell you, if you read the book, it's Paul, a biography by N.T. Wright.
Oh, yeah?
Who believes that Paul, or who at least puts the argument out that Paul is in Ephesus in prison, and this takes place during Paul's stay in Ephesus.
Oh, in the 2.5 years?
Yep, and part of that time being wrapped up in Ephesus, that he is in prison there, and that's where these letters come from. And he makes a decent argument. I'm just saying, I personally have never gone down that road. Thankfully, I don't think that, I don't think if I have where Paul was when he wrote that wrong, that God's not going to let me in,
Right.
You're gonna, no, sorry, you missed it.
But
Yeah.
it is interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. No, and like I say, he's got some good reasons for that.
But he's able to write here. He's able to entertain guests.
Yeah, somebody's taking these letters, and
I'm sure that this Roman soldier has got an earful of Christianity.
yeah, you just think, oh man, he's going. I didn't draw Paul again today, did I? Yeah, give that to the new guy. Yeah, yeah. It's there's several here with him. He says at the end, Epaphras is there. Aristarchus, John Mark is there. Demas. And so, there are several that are with him and coming and going. But again, Wright makes the argument that it would be much more possible for Onesimus to go find Paul in prison in Ephesus than in Rome. From we believe Philemon to be around Colossae. So that's it. But anyway, it's interesting to kind of dig into. It's fun. You want to close this?
All right. Father, thank you for providing us with your will and your way and your word, and help us, Father, to apply those things to our life that you have provided for us. And tonight, Father, help us to have faith in the supremacy and the all-sufficiency of Christ, and the fact that He is our Creator and He is our salvation. Help us, Father, to understand that, as did Paul, to the point that we indeed want to share it with those that are about us. Forgive us when we fail you. Help us to apply these scriptures. Help us as we're mindful of not being mean-spirited and careful as we communicate with others. In Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen.